morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon with Chapter 21, Part B. You'll remember we ended last week with Jordan on his knees praying, "God be merciful to me, a fool." Toward evening, Stonecroft called for him. "I still make one stipulation," said Jordan. "I will go wherever you wish to take me, but I will not meet Gaunt." "I have no intention that you should," Stonecroft replied. "It is a movement, not a man, that I wish you to study. I simply wish you to see some of the things that are actually being done by the movement, that you may form your own estimate of them." Jordan nodded his assent. Presently, as the carriage rolled eastward, Jordan said abruptly, "You've not told me about your own story yet. I should be glad to hear it." Stonecroft thereupon began to narrate how his acquaintance with the League of Service had begun. His anger against Butler, his resentment at Butler's interference, the gradual awakening of his own conscience, his determination to examine for himself those causes of offense which Butler had enumerated against him, and all those subsequent stages of his thought, until the hour when he had acknowledged his wrong and had determined on its own reparation. "But surely it is a monstrous thing that Butler should claim the right to interfere with your personal liberty. You must have felt it so," said Jordan. "I did. I was never so enraged at anything in my life. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to see that Butler was right. Right not only morally, but socially." "I confess I can't follow the process of your thought," said Jordan. "Yet it is quite simple," said Stonecroft. "If Isaiah or Jeremiah had been editors of a great newspaper in Jerusalem, I imagine they would have done precisely what Butler is doing. I gather that they made it their business to interfere a good deal with the liberty of the individual, and the ground of their interference was the same as Butler's, viz., that all individual liberty is conditioned by the general social welfare, and that the right of a community to happiness takes precedence over all individual rights." "But Butler threatened you." "Well, I both needed and deserved the threat. If I had threatened you, you would have attacked me," said Jordan bitterly. "My dear doctor, you would never have threatened me, and you know it. The most you would have ever done would have been to preach a sermon on social duty full of glittering generalities, which I should have promptly applied to someone else. That's the vice of the pulpit. It deals with mankind in the mass. It is afraid to deal with the individuals. It grows eloquent about the tragedy of the poor man's one ewe lamb, but it never takes the rich thief by the throat and says, 'Thou art the man.' Oh, don't think I am blaming or deriding you. I know the difficulties of your position. But those very difficulties make it necessary for men like Butler to do what you cannot. Doctor, I have lived 50 years, and for 20 of those years I have attended your ministry. In all those 50 years, Butler was the first man who spoke to me as an individual, honestly, searchingly, and without fear." Jordan did not reply. No reply was possible. But his thoughts were painful, for he knew that Stonecroft's accusation was true. The heroic, the prophetic element of a public ministry, that element which creates men of the Knox and of the Savonarola type, the masters of the conscience, the dictators of morals, the regenerators of society, that element was not in him. His ideal had been to go smoothly, to conciliate all men, especially the wealthy, to avoid offense. Ah, how mean it all seemed, and how unworthy. Once more his pride was on the rack. Stonecroft had virtually condemned his whole ministry as futile, and he wondered how many more of his hearers scorned him in their hearts, even while their lips praised him. The carriage was at that moment passing a shop outside which a long line of people waited. The rain was beginning to fall, but they stood silent and meek, moving a step at a time towards the door of the shop. No one appeared to take any notice of them. Well-dressed persons hurried by upon their errands of business and pleasure, without so much as a glance at this abject throng. But as Jordan looked more closely, he saw half a dozen men and women passing along the line, speaking earnestly to man after man. As the white electric light flashed upon them through the driving shower, he saw that each of these busy people wore upon the bosom a simple cross of a quaint design. "Do you know what that means?" said Stonecroft. "That long line of miserables are waiting for bread. They have no homes. They will sleep under Brooklyn Bridge or on the park seats or anywhere else they can find to do so tonight. And who are those persons talking with them? Members of the League of Service. Gaunt has lately opened half a dozen shelters. Those men and women with the cross upon the breast are giving these poor creatures tickets for a free bed and breakfast in the shelter. I didn't know Gaunt did that sort of work, said Jordan. I thought that his movement meant little more than oratorical fireworks in Madison Square Garden. And that is why I wanted you to come with me tonight, said Stonecroft. The League of Service is the union of all who love in the service of all who suffer. The carriage stopped. We must walk now, said Stonecroft. They turned down a narrow, crowded street. Saloons flared upon every hand. Evil faces were numerous. The whole aspect of the street was repellent and even dangerous. Twice they passed windows that were boarded up. Those were saloons, said Stonecroft, and the vilest in the street. We have closed them, and we are not loved for it. Some day there will be trouble over it, so our women workers say. Do women work here? Said Jordan. Why not? Said Stonecroft. It is here that the misery of life is greatest, because the vice and the crime are greatest. Therefore this street is the headquarters of our sisters of the poor. A woman, you know, is much safer than a man in such a district as this. Her best defense is her goodness. Even the worst respect that. The words sent a pang through Jordan's heart, for he remembered that it was this very sisterhood that Olivia had joined. For the first time he realized what her life must mean, a life of self-denial and hard toil, and even of peril amid scenes of misery and degradation. At last they stopped before a plain and dingy building. It had been a dance hall, as the half-effaced sign declared. People were passing into it by twos and threes, some of them with smiles and cheerful feet, many more with a furtive and half-reluctant air. Stonecroft and Jordan entered, taking seats in the darkest corner they could find, from which they could be observers without being observed. Presently a group of a half-dozen women, all dressed alike in plain gray, and each wearing on the breast a silver cross, took their seats upon the platform. A moment later they began to sing to a soft and almost inaudible piano accompaniment, stealing away, stealing away, stealing away home to Jesus. The words were scarcely a hymn. They were rather the long plaintive sigh of a weary human heart. The congregation, which now quite filled the hall, listened in perfect silence. The majority of faces in the crowd were hard and stolid. Many seemed visibly bruised by the buffetings of circumstance. All were careworn and weary, but as the simple melody rose and fell, a soft light seemed to fall upon them all. Stealing away, home to Jesus. Surely it was the inarticulate cry of their own souls. They heard the plaintive words. And then, without announcement, one of these gray-garbed women prayed in a voice that seemed but a continuation of the music. So soft it was, so finely toned to the spirit of the hymn. The prayer was simplicity itself. It was like a prayer of a little child. Perhaps that was why it moved the people so much. Perhaps the hardest and roughest of them had memories of little children long since estranged or lost. Perhaps that was why it was that Jordan felt the smart of unaccustomed tears in his eyes, for his thoughts went back to a small white room in which Olivia had slept as a little girl, and a white bed beside which she prayed. The prayer ended, and another hymn was sung. There was no address, no sermon. Palmer had taken the chair in the center of the platform, but his duties were merely normal. He called upon one and another of his strange audience to speak, until the speaking became free and general. Jordan sat entranced. He had never heard speaking like this. Men who by their own confession had been drunkards, thieves, and outcasts, rose and in heartfelt words, and often with streaming eyes, narrated how they had been saved and delivered. A suicide told of how a woman's hand laid upon his arm as he was hurrying to his doom turned him back to life and hope. She's here now, God bless her. She's sitting not far from me, but she doesn't want to be seen. All eyes turned in the direction that the speaker indicated. Jordan unconsciously rose to look. but saw only a shy, grey figure in the dim light under the gallery. And then while he stood thus, thrilled and excited from the same dim spot under the gallery, a man rose and began to speak in a low, clear voice, and with unmistakable accent of culture. Jordan's face became deadly pale. It seemed as though a great wave had passed over him, blinding and bewildering him, and through this obliterating wave the voice reached him in snatches. "I was a wanderer, a prodigal. I have come home." So the phrases of the speaker reached him, and then in an instant the wave passed, and he knew the voice. "Oh, my boy, he cried. It was all he could say. He would have fallen if not for Stonecroft putting his arm around him. In another moment other arms were about his neck. The shy, grey figure was by his side. The long-lost son had found his father. And that's the end of chapter 21. Next week we'll continue with 22, A Tragedy. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.